Hi, Dave. I want to introduce you to David Wunderlin. David, this is Dave Vislisel. So I'm going to call Dave Dave and David David. So don't get confused about who you are. So David Wunderlin and Dave Vislisel for tonight and alone anyway.
Now I'm thoroughly confused. Who's who?
At least you remember who you are.
Nice to meet you, David.
Yeah. The topic tonight is really I hope that you understand I'm trying to make a connection to current events by looking back at the historical basis for these events. And this one struck me particularly. I have read parts of Albion's Seed, but I thought that little video on the first Appalachians was very revealing. I hope you had a chance to see it. I'm asking Larry to kind of summarize Albion's Seed and basically lay out the four groups that he describes as the cultural and ethnic basis of most of the U.S. So, if you don't mind, Larry, why don't we start out with that?
Surely. I found this book pretty much by accident about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and listened to it on audio. And I hadn't really given a lot of thought up to that point of the various types of cultures, separate cultures that might have existed in the colonies prior to the Revolution, and how all those people got to be where they were, and how and who they were and what they were like. A lot of history is focused on what people did and not how they lived. Yeah. And this probably did what I thought was a masterpiece of explaining that. And as Fischer describes that, he goes into the actual background of where these people came from. He goes back to England to understand the cultures and the certain circumstances that caused these people to come more or less as groups into the New World. The first group to arrive was the Puritans. They were being persecuted. I guess it was sometime after the Catholic Church Anglican rift, and they were being persecuted because they had such a very, very strict religion, and they weren't really paying any attention to what the king said about what their religion should be. So it came over a period of about 10 years. About 25,000 or so Puritans showed up in the Massachusetts area, and then sort of spread from there. They had a very, very organized, structured life and mores and circumstances there. If you didn't conform, you were shunned, which was given that there's no place else to go at that time. It was a grievous punishment. They grew up. We hear about the Puritans, how strict they were, and they were, but they really stand out because of how organized their society was. Low crime rates, lots of conformity. If you were a single man and living alone in Puritan Massachusetts, you had to go live with someone else. You had to join a family. So people reported on people. It was kind of totalitarian in some sense. If you were non-conforming, people would rat you out. So they wanted everybody to be just the way they were supposed to be. The second group that came over was the Quakers, and we think of Quakers as kind of oddball religious people like Richard Nixon and those kind of people. And but they had a very organized society, but much less judgmental than the Puritans. They were open, friendly people. They accepted other religions within their own sect. They pretty much towed the line. But they were a much more peaceful, forgiving, organized kind of folk. They settled in the Delaware and Pennsylvania areas around Philadelphia, and that's where their major focus was when they first arrived. There was about 23,000 of those folks that came over within a relatively short period of time. It was actually about 40 years. The first group of Puritans had about 20,000. The third group were the Virginia Cavaliers. In England, there was a lot of turmoil, and if you weren't a landed gentry person, then you had no power. if your brother was older than you, and then he got everything when your father died. So you had all these people over here, all these men who were highly educated and highly cultured that had no right to any property at all. And so there was a point where those folks decided, because of pressures at home and just political pressures, to up and leave. And they settled in the Virginia and Maryland areas. And that lasted about 40 years, and lasted about 40 years, and there was about 45,000 of those folks. These folks were not accustomed to work, so they decided that they're just going to get a lot of indentured servants to come over. So they would attract people to come over and do all their work while they played, and they played heartily. They were very strict with their own families, but they definitely like to have a good time. And sport was their big thing: hunting, wild animals, and those kinds of things. Almost to the man, womanizers. There was the highest rape incident in that area than any other place in the colonies. It occurred to me. One of my things I remember most about them is that they're at one point in time they were Anglicans, and there was an active religious discussion, a philosophical discussion on whether women have souls. So, not in the least misogynistic at all. So, I don't know how that worked out. They figured that out at some point in time. Around that time, the borderlands in England, between England and Scotland, started to become more peaceful. There have been wars and battles going along that line between Scotland and England for 700-800 years prior to that. The landed gentry up there would let tenant farmers come onto their lands, and they expected them to fight for them whenever there was a battle. And there were battles all the time. They battled each other. They battled the English battled the Scots. It was just a constant state of warfare. And these people really didn't get the kind of cultural development as the rest of England was going through at that time, over that period of time. These people were really stuck in the Middle Ages. They were violent, prideful for whatever reason, poor, clannish, very, very loyal to their own family and their own clan, even to the point of intermarriage. They settled their disputes at the end of a gun or whatever weapon that they had. And so those people were hard to handle. They started a migration when the borderlands started to become settled, and they were kind of pushed out or just basically displaced from their lands. They had no place else to go. They were going to the cities, make a lot of trouble. Nobody wanted them around. The British at one point decided that they could use them as sort of a surrogate soldiers over in Ireland to help suppress the Irish Catholics. But even the guy points out in the story, even at that point, they felt like the Irish Catholics were more palatable than the people from the borderlands. So they invited them to leave as well. Some of them came over as try to get into the serf business or the servant business in the Virginia area. When they found out that these guys who were coming over from the Irish Scots that were coming over were just as likely to kill them as they were to serve them, they invited them to go west. And so they could quit that practice pretty quickly. The Quakers had the same experience. They thought that they could just show them love and patience. And when they found out that they didn't pay attention to any of the laws, they didn't pay attention to the constables, they were just marauder, serving their own selves and settling their own scores. They invited them to head west into Indian territory, which, given the disposition and the culture that they had, was a perfect place. These are the people that were living on the frontier there for generations, were now on a new frontier, and all they had to do was fight the Indians for it. So they were the guys that they were the tip of the spear in the Indian Wars. Others that came into Virginia and Maryland area, they went south. Virginia, as you recall, the map of America at that point in time, Virginia was a huge, huge place. It wasn't just with the Virginia of now. It was Virginia through Kentucky, up through Maryland now, down some through South Carolina and such. So it was a big place. And so they again pushed them west, and they ended up in the Appalachians. And sort of like in that the picture behind you, they have an electric meter. That's interesting. That's
this is a current photo.
I gotcha.
Well,
the thing there was about the migration of the border people lasted about 50 some odd years, and estimates are between 250,000 and 400,000 people. So you compare that to the 20 and 30,000 or 40,000 from the other groups, you can see that there's potential there for just a huge impact on every area that they go to. Mm-hmm. And given that they were such forceful people that really didn't take no for an answer and felt like they were in the right, and having them out in the wilderness was a good place for them to be, unless you had to confront them. So if you could recall, some of you were when I first joined this group, we were talking about the Joe Lepore book, How the South Won the Civil War. Mm-hmm. That book sort of picks up where this stops, because the people that were populated the South and eventually before, during, after the Civil War started moving west, many of those people were of the same cultural background as the border people, the Appalachians, as you might call them. Yeah. So, that's, and they moved out to the west, they moved up to the Dakotas, they moved to, out to Idaho and all those places out there that we now call red states. Yeah. Well, so the culture has changed quite a bit with that group. Yeah. Dave?
There a question. What period, how does the book end? What are the last people or migrations or groups of people that your book, Albion, describes? Does it get into, for example, any of the German migration, any of the, I'm also thinking about this. My wife is part Slovak, and some of her people came into Appalachia because they were coal miners. And right. So there was a channel coming in. Does it cover anything other than the British Isles, basically?
Well, there are criticisms that have been leveled at Fischer because he didn't take look at the effect of Native Americans, and there's Germans, there's other groups that have come in along the way, didn't put them on at the same level of examination as those other groups.
Okay, so simultaneous, but he focused on people from the British Isles, basically.
Yeah, he felt like the people that were here first established the culture. Right. And the people that came in later tended to adopt that culture, maybe tweak it some over time.
That's right.
The basic mechanisms of the culture that existed where they landed, or what they had to deal with and adapt to, just like people coming to the United States from other countries now. They bring their music, or they'll bring this and that, but the basics still have to be there.
Yeah. I think it's an important point. The first folks who come into the area establishing that culture, it's hard to displace the culture. The way we accomplished it generally is through either genocide or displacement of some sort. The Trail of Tears cleared the way for the development of the South. The issue and the reason why I wanted to focus on this group called the Borderers, or the Appalachians, is that I was exploring some maps, and I looked at a map of the distribution by county of those with predominant Scots-Irish, what they call Scots-Irish background.
Mhm.
I took that map and overlaid it with the election results from 2020. And it is a remarkable match. I'll share that with you later. But the idea that this group of people in particular, you can think of this as NASCAR loving, pickup truck, shotgun in the back, listen to country music, all the cliches. This is the group that constitutes the MAGA movement. And it is predominantly a Scotch-Irish or border group. And for me, that's what gave this, it made this topic important. And these people have been, nobody wanted them in England. Nobody wanted them in Ireland. Nobody wanted them in Pennsylvania. They were only accepted where they could come into new territory. So that typifies them. They were the first ones there. So they feel like they have a sense of ownership of this area. If you ask them who they are, they would not identify themselves as Scotch-Irish or borderers. They probably wouldn't even recognize those terms. They would say, we're Americans. They were the first people to declare themselves as strictly Americans, not hyphenated Americans. They were Americans. And they dominate our political landscape now, not only in the South. And by the way, that map I was talking about, Kentucky is bright red, entirely red, and we are right in the middle of it. We are the core of that group. And it's sometimes hard for me to understand why that is so, but we are right there. Perhaps it's because we are borderers. We're on a border state between North and South. So I think it's an important idea. And what I want to bring to the fore is, if people have been exploiting this group for years and years, taking advantage of them, if we're so smart on the left, why can't we learn what to do to enfranchise these folks? What is it about us that alienates them so much? I've always said that I don't think the modern Republican Party is a conservative party. It is a reactionary party, and they are reacting to, perhaps it's the Puritan background or the Quaker background, who knows, but they're reacting. They don't have a coherent philosophy of their own. They don't espouse, they don't seek to proselytize or to spread the core values of Appalachia. They're content to stay by themselves, leave us alone. Let's get back and make America great again when we were in charge. So I'd like to hear some takes on that. We can focus on the other groups if you like, but I'm very interested in this because I'd like to hear your reactions. Dave, what you were saying about other groups, I think is important. I'd like to start with you because you don't have that. As I assume you don't identify with the border group. It's a different identity. How do you see these people?
Well, I have a complicated, if you look deeply into the history of, say, the Czechs and the Slovaks, that was formed, those countries were populated heavily and formed by, of course, there were natives there, as the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire began to break up. The hordes from the east came, from the east came west. So it was wave after wave, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, et cetera, et cetera. There were smaller tribes too, and what landed in present-day Bohemia, that part of Czechoslovakia, was one of these Slavic tribes led by a guy named Czech, C-E-C-H. And he's being pushed along by the other hordes, the much bigger ones, trying to find a place, how far do we go? It was like a tidal wave pushing them. He landed in the Vltava Valley, which is where Prague is centered now. And there was a Celtic tribe there. It had been there for a long time. The Romans write about it. I don't know if Julius Caesar going back that far or whatever. It was clear that land in there, the Romans called it the land of the bow, the name of that tribe. But they were a Celtic tribe. And today, the people in Prague area, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic anyway, they celebrate St. Patrick's Day because they say we are at least part Irish, because that's where Czech settled in with the Celtic tribe and they mixed and matched. So, there's nothing pure. That's really the point.
Right. Well, what is
my own DNA traces a lot of Scottish after the Slavic, mainly, Czech, that central part of Europe, but it's Slavic. I have about a 35 or 40% Scottish in my DNA. Now, those things are suspect and so on, but it's this intermingling. And then what do I do? And my people, we land in Iowa because that's where both the town and city people and a lot of farm people were settled. Southern Minnesota, Iowa, pushed on into Nebraska, the Dakotas, down into Oklahoma, and so on. I think of the My Antonia novel by Willa Cather, how the lives were in some ways similar to what I watched on the so similar in the YouTube that I watched, Mike, just a little while ago, before I joined in, and how similar that is to the behavior and the customs and the mores of the people, of my people who are the farmers in Iowa. So all that leads me to wonder if these aren't just layers of slight differences, because people in those days and those generations, they experienced much more in common than they did separately.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Then you go into, what the relationship, and I think it's fascinating question and thought, is how do the conservative, blue collar, feeling disenfranchised and that we've been left behind, people through, the Rust Belt of Ohio, as well as the farmers in Iowa. Iowa's become a very, very conservative place. I would argue that there are probably as many Poles and Germanic and other origin people that create the Republican, really conservative end today. And those people, they've forgotten their origins. It doesn't matter anymore. That was grandpa, grandma, and so on.
Right.
So we are the blue collar people who have been ripped away. We've been forgotten by the Democrats, Republicans as well. Yeah. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah,
that's kind of my thinking of how to frame all this. And
one of the things is, we grew up in the post-war era where we seem to have much more in common because we had just fought, a horrible war. All of us joined together. There was a lot of intermingling in the services. I think those of us who grew up in the post-war era tend to think of ourselves as American first, and we minimize the influence of our genetics and our culture. But David, you've been listening to all this, and I want to hear. I'm interested in understanding what everyone's understanding is of the ethnic basis for the division in America. Am I overemphasizing? Am I exaggerating that too much? I think what Dave says is important, that there are lots of things mixed together in a melting pot. But the ethnicity at the core, it's pretty obvious in Black communities, in Jewish communities. But do you think it's true in this? I don't know what you call it, the Appalachian community as well.
Yeah, I think ethnic. You can slice it ethnically. You can slice it economically. You can slice it geographically. You can slice it into population centers. Why New York and Washington D.C. and California so liberal? Why are the mid-America states much more conservative? But it's interesting to hear all of this. Because, and Larry, your summary there was great for me to hear because the way these people solve their problems was with guns, and that was very clear in that in that little video, and it's historic to them from their homeland, and then they brought it and enculturated it into their geographic area, and they were also very independent. You know, don't want government. The Whiskey Rebellion apparently had a lot to do with them because they did not want to be taxed for their liquor. We're independent of that. Don't bring big government down on us. And so when you take that forward to, I guess the Trump era, if you want to, what did he tap into? I don't know if it was that. But I feel like it tapped into, I'm the little guy and all the big guys trample all over me. And here's somebody who's taking my side. And so I'm just going to be very loyal to him. I believe in him. I think he is going to help me. I don't know. I don't know how they feel now. Well, a lot of Republicans apparently still are very much loyal to him for that. I think for that reason, but and I think there are many people who say, I don't know if you listened to the Republican debate last night, but Tim Scott talked about how LBJ's Great Society hurt his ethnic, the Black community, more than it helped. It took them backwards in the comment he made. And in terms of their prosperity, making them dependent on government. So those who are not dependent on government, I think, reject that the government gets too far in, but now I'm getting out on a limb here, so I better tell that.
Steve, I want to hear from you. I appreciate what you're saying, David. I think there's an undercurrent, and you're saying you can slice it lots of different ways, and it becomes obvious. I guess the old expression is there are only two kinds of people who divide the world into two types of people and people who don't. So it's but the division that we see. What I have been wrestling with, and I know I've spoken about this before, is I constantly hear people, my peers, people generally on the left side of the political spectrum, say, I can't understand why these people think the way they do. I can't understand why. And does this viewpoint of looking at the ethnic underbelly, does that assist us in understanding that, or am I stretching this out? I don't. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think it could assist us. It could assist us. Anything that helps you understand people's outlook and motivations and where their beliefs are, I think can be helpful in bridging the gap between where you are and where they are. I have difficulty with, we've talked about this before too, with what's going on is a lot of people go on beliefs rather than on knowledge and facts. Mm-hmm. And that leads to following conspiracy theories and political lies and demagogues, courting them even if it's not in their best interest. So I'm not sure that the cultures that were described in the Quaker or Puritan or borderers or Cavaliers. Yeah. Cavaliers to the side there. They were the noblemen that were coming over. But the rest of the folks, I think it helps to see where they came from. But it's still a bit of a puzzle to me about where they are today.
Yeah.
I know I have family background, Swiss and German on my mother's side. My father's, the Smiths, a little harder to track. They were probably some kind of horse thieves somewhere in the past, because I can't really find a name older than my grandfather. But at least on my mother's side, the Swiss and German influence predominated. So we're very organized and follow the rules, and think that you pay attention to what authorities have to say, but you don't pay attention to the point where you ignore the truth or the facts as best you can discern them. So I still don't understand how we get to the point that people will accept anything as fact when it, or I guess not as fact, but just have beliefs that they want to follow as opposed to following facts.
Yeah. One of the things that I recall, I guess it was in the video. I've been watching a lot of things about Appalachia, so I don't remember where, but there was a quote from one woman who was talking about her preacher, and she says something to the effect of, "I don't care if it isn't true, I still believe it."
Yeah.
Yeah. But Larry, I want to go back to something you were saying. This group of borderers you mentioned were kind of passed over and were still in a state of mind that was more appropriate for the Middle Ages than it was for in 17th century England. Is that at the key of this, that these folks missed out on the Enlightenment, and that they continue to go forward with a propensity for superstition and belief? Am I stretching it to say something like that?
I think you could say that to a degree. As far as mysticism and such, other groups that came over, had their turn. The Puritans had their turn with witchcraft and such. So, in terms of having a very unusual beliefs and superstitions, I think that definitely these ghosts had it, but others did as well. Mm-hmm. I liked what Steve said just a minute ago in terms of how these folks are acting on what I would call faith rather than facts, and that faith bears an emotional content to it. It gets into who you are. And when you talk about facts that contradict that, I think that it's a struggle for them to grasp those facts and to try to reconcile that with what their faith or their community tells them. You imagine being in a rural community today and going to church and you being the only person in that congregation that voted for Joe Biden. And people knew that. I think that would be very difficult. Or that you support abortion rights to some degree, or any of these things that they identify with the outsiders or the people that are up east or out west and such, that they think are destructive to the society. And the influence of peer pressure and the clannishness, the isolation that these communities have. When you're in a rural community, it's usually a pretty tight community, just because of proximity. It makes it more difficult, I think, for you to be the lone wolf, or to express views that are unconventional to the people around you. Much easier in a city. You can always find somebody in a reasonably sized city who views the world similar to yourself. Out there, you marry it, your in-laws have it. It's pretty tough to go against that. I think that in the aggregate, that we still have a lot of that culture that still permeates the country, just as we have a lot of the Puritan Quaker culture that permeates that. You lose the Puritanism piece of it, and you find the Puritan passion for education. All these huge institutions of learning up there in that area aren't by accident. It's because the people in that area really valued it. And you have the brotherly love kind of thing that Philadelphia is famous for. People who are, they'll have "be kind" signs in their front yard. But you don't go down in Appalachia and see "Be Kind" signs in their yards, but you see it up here. So that's the part of who we are in other areas. So there's a real rift there. If you read the last page of the article I sent you, the author of that review indicated that he was a little depressed because it looked like the Anglicans from the Virginia area kind of merged with the outback people in the South and built huge plantations. The aristocracy took over that, and then the Quakers and Puritans sort of went the other way, and so we're now kind of locked in these two different mindsets and cultural reference points.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think
something
that's
about the isolation. I was watching an interview that a fellow from he was actually from Canada, and he came and interviewed a doctor, or actually a technician of some sort in the medical field in West Virginia, and they drove around in West Virginia. And it kind of surprised me because he was asking about cell phones and internet access. And this guy says, most of this area, we don't have any cell phone connection and we don't have any interaction. And the guy says, well, what do you do? And he says, well, we hike, we play music, we do things. I mean, this is today. And this was in an old coal mining town.
right.
Dave, is the isolation that he was pointing to, and that I have observed also in working in Eastern Kentucky, is that something that's true from your knowledge in Iowa and other parts of the country? Is isolation one of the factors? David, to your point about how you slice things up, is it about how isolated you are in the place you live? Is it geographic? What do you think? Is that same isolation true in Des Moines or in Iowa City?
Well, things have changed and they are changing. One of our he's a black, almost adopted honorary grandson has moved. He's Ugandan originally, migrated to this country, but he grew up here. And now he is a CPA working in Des Moines. And that's pretty far afield for him, being an East Coaster, Massachusetts and Syracuse, New York. And he's having a little trouble adjusting to those people. So even though Des Moines is a pretty sophisticated city, it's an insurance capital these days. I don't know if you knew that. You remember when what is the city in Hartford, Connecticut used to be an insurance capital. Des Moines has become a huge and 30, 40, 50 years now. So he's kind of working in that kind of circle of stuff. And he says the thinking there really seems to be different. But mostly who he hangs out with in this Ernst & Young outfit, huge firm that does audits and so on. They're the CPA big companies and so on. There's 300 of these people working for Ernst & Young in their Des Moines office. Most of these people are from elsewhere. So even he can't tell me what the hell is going on in Iowa.
Yeah.
I know that my cousin's kids have largely moved out of there. The ones who are there are still farming. They're very conservative. They've gotten more conservative, and they've gotten some of them, and many of these are the ones who moved to the Chicago area and the Minneapolis area. They say, we've worked hard all our lives. We grew up, we struggled, we had to pay for our own way. We worked hard. We got ours. What the hell's wrong with these people? Why can't they go out and do what Americans have always done? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, quit complaining and get to work. That kind of thing. So what I'm seeing, what I know from Iowa is a little bit warped. I still have a few friends there and classmates and so on. They're mostly on the conservative side or pretty close to the middle. But I don't even think, Michael, and guys, that it seems to me And I'm wondering what, Michael, you might have dug out, if anything, and statistically on this. I wonder if education, meaning formal education, college, mix of arts and sciences and maybe business or whatever people went into. Is that maybe not a bigger divider between the people who they've become, college leads you to become generally some sort of white collar professional or semi-professional in some area or another. Staying at home and not going to college, not doing that, or staying home on the farm and elsewhere, does that maybe lead you more into this, why can't I get ahead, and why I've been screwed so badly by the powers that be? And that makes me reactionary and clinging to Trump for succor, and he's going to be the savior. Is there anything, is education maybe a bigger divide than isolation? Because I don't think places are very isolated even anymore. What little I know about Appalachia is they've got cell phones. I mean, they're connected. If they're educated, if they've learned how to use them, they're as connected as the rest of us, except for the areas where you have streets. That's what
what I was trying to do is draw a parallel with what Larry was saying before about the border people between Scotland and England who were left out, who didn't, education is not just going to school. Education is what you experience in your day-to-day life.
That's true.
And here, if you go on the streets of Louisville, probably 9 out of 10 people or more have got a cell phone in their pocket, and about half of them are looking at the cell phone as they're walking by you.
Yep.
That's not true in Eastern Kentucky. There are some places, but the connectivity isn't there, and the number of people who have the phones is not as great. So you're less likely to be using that. David, does that make sense? I mean, you were talking about how we slice and dice things up. What Dave is asking is education the thing that separates? I'm not sure if that's not just a kind of a post hoc phenomenon that, if you look at these groups, you'll see that some of them are more, have more college degrees than the other, but that's a result of who they are, not a cause. What do you think?
I think economic or Trump education. And I think that what your lifestyle status is, for lack of a better word, has a lot to do with what your value system is, how I feel about how I'm doing and how safe am I, and how I can, quote unquote, get ahead or stay healthy or have good family life and that sort of thing. So, and we've talked a little bit about faith in a demagogue type thing, and you can have faith in religion, and some of the religions are very cultural. I wonder how the value system crosses over. What's the value system of a liberal versus a conservative? And there are a lot in common, but maybe the dividing line is more on the economic or societal principle than any other, to me.
Yeah. Steve is again trying to tie what we're talking about into current events. We've got major strikes going on in the country. As you look at folks who are striking against the auto unions or even the folks in Hollywood, is this a result of their cultural background? It's a person who joins a union. Are they more or less likely to be of the same political persuasion? I understand Joe Biden is going to try to, he's going to try to woo them as a political strategy, but is he pulling something that's already there, or is he imposing something? I wonder what what these modern conflicts have as people stand up for different things, whether it's anti-abortion or gay rights, or in this case, their unions. Is this a result of this background? Does it have anything to do with it? I don't.
I would assume if you just look at the history of labor movements, if we just take the labor movement, that people learn, and that there are generations. You know, you tend to find people following in the footsteps of their parents or grandparents in terms of the type of jobs they hold. So if your parents worked in manufacturing and were in the union, and you as a child end up there, I think it'll be a big influence on your culture and what you value. But they're part of a bigger system too. We have an economic system, a global economic system, and a national economic system that, no matter how you look at it, it has some inequalities in it. And there are people just trying to do the best they can without the power always to do something about the situation that they're in. So I can see why they would join together for either, for this labor movement, economic reasons, or for other values that they have, and be it women's right, civil rights, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been, Kentucky has shifted politically, or the whole country has shifted actually from Democrat to Republican, but Kentucky particularly, I recall when, it was practically every county judge and every state senator was Democrat, and now we have an overwhelming majority Republican. But Larry, getting back to those divisions that you listed in the beginning, is it possible for us to look at those strains? How do we modify that view that he puts forth in this book to apply it today? Do we just add additional groups? Do we look at the evolution of each of those four groups? As Dave was saying, is it intermingling with people from other cultures? I mean, some people describe America as a melting pot. Other people describe it as a mosaic, where we have, separate cultural groups. Should we, or is it more fruitful for us? And I'm talking about winning the political game. I'm very concerned about a fascist takeover. And they obviously in Germany in the 30s, they were using ethnicity as a unifying characteristic behind the Nazi movement.
Right.
I guess my underlying question is that's what's going on now. And if there is a particular appeal to this group, this borderland group or this Appalachian group, and they do dominate among the people who, the areas where Trump had his greatest majority, corresponds to this group very, very tightly. Right. So is this group likely to lead us into fascism? And if that's the case, how do we undermine that effort?
Well, I think that one of the things the thoughts that occurred to me is that these two groups, as we describe them, you could call them the left and the right, they have different definitions of the word freedom. Mm-hmm. On the right, for them, freedom is the ability to do whatever they want without interference, without necessarily conflict outside of their own locality, their own clan, and things that they live by. I think on the left, it tends to be more about the systems of control and the boundaries of what you can and can't do, and how that the government can actually support those things, or not, at least not interfere with those things of free expression. On the other side, I think it's more conformity. Cultures anywhere are very difficult to wedge, as you mentioned a while ago, Michael. tend to get exterminated as opposed to shifted over a period of time. But I think that they're around the edges. I think there are people within on the right side of the spectrum that can be approached. And I think that the way you approach them is not through the mass media. I think that you do it through contact. You become you show them how things exist in your world, or how your thought processes work and what you see, and listen to what their concerns are, and how they are they have nothing to fear from what your proclivities are, and try to gain that, and you start to show a little bit of doubt, a little bit of openness. That's really hard to do. You can't do that very well over Zoom. You do that face to face, people that you know, and you listen. I have cousins who are like this, and I don't argue with them. I just listen and ask them questions, and then they have to deal with what's the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Trump is totally innocent. Oh, well, what evidence?
I have a question for you about your map. And that is, if you looked at other presidential races, would the map be the same for Barack Obama, for George Bush, for?
I don't have access to that parallel map. That's a good question. I would love to have that.
Yeah.
I don't have the raw data to create it. I was relying on something that was presented to me. But I think generally, that, like you were saying before, this can be sliced and diced in a lot of different ways. I would venture to say that it's probably pretty similar, but it's more pronounced now. The divisions are stronger now. The majority in certain areas is much larger. In other words, it's concentrated more.
Micah, do you think that's true on the right as well, on the left? Those same, you take that same.
I didn't see that. It was much more scattered. The ethnic identity of people in blue states is not as concentrated as it is in rural states. It's what we were saying before. If you go to New York City, you're going to find lots of diversity. But if you go to Iowa City, well, Iowa City's a bad example of universities there. But if you go to, Owensboro, Kentucky, you're less likely to find.
Or Cedar Rapids or Mason City.
Right.
David, think about it though.
Yeah.
What I understood is that in the last election, Biden won something like 1,000 counties, and Trump won something like 10,000 counties.
Right.
But Biden had 7 million more votes.
Right.
Because the concentrations are around cities and populated areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Biden could win California and New York by 100% and still lose the election because of the way we've structured our system. And that's one of the reasons why we're probably never going to get the Electoral College thrown out, is because these predominantly red states now understand that if we make this a more like a classic democracy, they'll never win. They'll never win.
Maybe if small states realized that they would be dominated by the big city centers.
Sure.
No.
Well, what Larry said raises another question, and that's whether, you got educational divides. When we're talking about unionizing and going on with the unions, they're mostly blue collar workers. Now that many of them may be educated, college degrees, maybe even beyond. They just like to work with their hands or whatever. But I kind of wonder if another division, city versus country, that's it, city versus country, or urban versus small towns, prairies, farms, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is a couple 100,000, whether there's differences, and that's really a major part of the split too. the more urbanized you are, the more democratic or more liberal you are, let's say, or progressive versus the other. Is that a factor there
No.
too?
No.